Back on the floor here with Dan, Rich, and Matt. You were saying that you think that part of the motivation for bad banks, setting aside the obvious moral hazard of taking all the money out, all the things that we know, but you think that there's an aspect there of trying to deal with accounting issues as well.
Well, yeah, because that's really the only difference is they take the rule that says you have to write down the value of the bond if you can't sell it.
Right.
And so they take that rule away in the bad bank. But then when they want to
sell... So you're forcing
the
private banks to account for it one way, mark to market, there's no market, it's 22 cents.
It would be easier to just let the private bank not market to market like they did with Latin American bonds 20 years ago. They stayed in business. If they would have had this rule, they would have been out of business now. So they make the bad bank. Now the government controls that one, doesn't have to follow the rules. But what do you think's going to happen when they want to sell the bonds back to somebody? They'll have to cancel the rule for the good bank.
Which makes me, if I back away from the whole thing, if you consider if you're going to nationalize something, would you rather nationalize it, Matt, by saying you're in charge and not giving them any money, or by giving them a few $1 trillion and then saying you can do whatever you want?
Well, definitely not the latter part. I would say that we're going to have to settle somewhere in the middle, and I'm not sure what the mix is going to be. I mean, balance sheets have to be shored up, capital has to be restored, but clearly there needs to be a lot more intelligent government oversight, and the government's going to need help.
And what would be some of the key characteristics, in your opinion, of that intelligence?
Well, I think part of it would be transparency in terms of derivatives and complex financial
that's if they don't do that,
foregone conclusion. Absolutely.
Canada,
I think pay for performance. I think the taxpayer is already on the hook tremendously. I'm not saying get rid of all bonuses everywhere, but people who fail need to be kicked out, not paid to be kicked out.
What about clawbacks for people that are able to build an institution, pay themselves a small fortune, and then a la Stan O'Neill, and then leave the mess that they built in everybody else's hands?
I'd be delighted to see clawbacks if they could be done. I mean, it's going to be a long legal fight. These guys have a lot of money for lawyers.
You got to wonder what they think. In other words, these people are. Stan O'Neill's a smart man. He has to see. He's like, man, I built this thing up. It's collapsed. Does he not have? I mean, not that any you have any more insight into the moral compass of these people than I do.
They made the bet, and they bet wrong. I mean, the fact is,
but they still got paid for their wrong bet. I just wonder, even to this day, as they watch CNBC, they watch the coverage, and they look at their accounts as they hang out on the boat in Monte Carlo, what they're thinking.
Blame the boards of directors.
Maybe I should give the money back. They're thinking maybe I should give the money back.
They're like,
doesn't think I should make the money
exactly.
back.
Anyway, Rich.
But one thing, looking at the banking system.
I don't think they're thinking that.
Look at the banking system now. Your credit default swap spreads have eased a bit. There's been some, stability in the system over the past several weeks.
Which is encouraging.
Which is encouraging. Surprisingly, according to our Cap IQ data, the #1 underwriter of debt is Bank of America. They're doing business. In fact, but
But they're also collateralized by the U.S. taxpayer. So they're doing business, but their bond offerings are insured by our tax money.
Right, they're a partner. In fact, about 10% of the institutions that have received TARP money have the funds exceed the market capitalization. So Citibank, $45 billion, courtesy of Washington, market cap $19 billion. So right down the list.
And yet we're worried, are we going to nationalize them? And we've already given them more money than they're worth. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, they're going to find out that the banks have only been loan originators, right? So when they get that done, then they're going to have
They being who?
The government. So here's some transparency and intelligence.
Sure.
They're going to find out that they have to then have good hedge funds and bad hedge funds to buy the loans. Otherwise, the banks are going to be done in a month.
What do you mean?
The banks are not really loaning out of their capital. They haven't been doing that for years.
Right.
They've been originating loans, securitizing them, and selling them
to the hedge funds.
Right. Now that
so the hedge
business
funds
is
are actually
dead.
carrying the loans.
Right. That's right.
The banks have just been creating these loans
so
and
now,
collecting
so you
fees.
give the banks a little money, they make the loans, they're out of money in a month. Now we need good hedge funds and bad hedge funds in order to keep going. They didn't realize that yet.
How do you deal with that? In other words, if you look at the shadow banking system, which is well described by Dan, the actual liability for a lot of the default on these loans doesn't necessarily rest at the bank, but at a hedge fund here up in Connecticut or in Europe or wherever.
Exactly. Well, as an equity investor at RS, we're looking for good banks, not bad banks. We're looking for banks, particularly in the small cap space, where we're very underweight. They're hard to find. But a simple bank, TCF Financial is a perfect example. That's our largest position in banks. This is a Midwest-based bank. They take deposits at branches, which they've built and opened, and they make loans in the community, residential, commercial. They have a much better balance sheet. They avoided all of the subprime, all the derivatives. Very straightforward on-balance sheet banks. They keep the loans on their balance sheet.
And I think he hits a great point, which is if you look at all the things that have happened on a government level, on a policy level, they're fantastically good for a bank that can actually be a bank.
Absolutely. Midwest Texas banks.
Midwest Texas, another one. Well, tell me a little bit about it.
Well, they didn't have those problems, but they have this wonderful spread now with zero cost of borrowing and 4 or 5% mortgages, which are low, but nothing compared to zero.
Sure.
Fed
The money
funds
machine.
rate. Exactly. So it's perfect, and they don't have any problems. So.
Yeah. Go ahead, Rich.
Rich there, though, in an environment where we're in the 15th month of a recession, waiting for our first monthly job gain since God knows when.
Right.
The fact that if you have a consumer that is not on strike, you have how can those banks prosper? It just seems so much uncertainty. So for the investor, the fence of very.
So as good as the math is, how do you still get bullish on the bank, considering that there's just not that much economic activity?
Well, not bullish on the sector, but you can be bullish on individual institutions, especially the idea being own the survivors, own the better banks that are going to gain market share, gain deposit share like TCF through the end.
You get the last word, Dan.
Yeah, try title companies who prosper no matter whether they get the loan or not. Try Fidelity National Financial, who's doing fabulous and near their highs. That's an easy one.
Nice names, good conversation. Thank you, gentlemen.